Hello and welcome to Tête-à-Tête, France 24's flagship interview show. Our guest today is Robert Malley. He's a former United States Special Envoy for Iran under Joe Biden. He was also a key negotiator of the 2015 nuclear deal with Iran. He's now a lecturer and senior fellow at Yale University, where he joins us from. Thank you very much, Rob Malley.
Thank you.
Is the war by the United States and Israel against Iran a just war?
No, I mean, it's not a justified war, it's not a necessary war, and it's not a lawful war. So it's hard to conclude from that it's a just war. And I think the best evidence for that fact is that US officials, including the president himself, are giving different versions about why they went to war, not on a daily basis, but almost on an hourly basis, and different versions about the objective of this war, similarly changing minute by minute. So I think that's, if you need any evidence of the fact that there's no logic and there's no necessity, there's no justification for the war, look no further than that.
Is this America's war? Secretary of State Marco Rubio said a couple of days ago that the US had to intervene because Israel was going to attack Iran. Iran would retaliate against United States bases and interest in the Gulf region. And so this was the justification. He tried to walk back those comments, but some, including in conservative circles, are saying this proves that it's not Trump's war, but it's Bibi's war.
So listen, I'd say, first of all, on its face, that was a patently absurd argument. If in fact, I mean, first of all, certainly you can't say that there's the imminent threat if the threat is that your ally is going to bomb a country that then is going to respond to. That's not an imminent threat. If that version was true, the threat emanated from Israel, and the US has plenty of ways of telling the Israelis, don't do it. I have no doubt in my mind that if President Trump had told Prime Minister Netanyahu not to do it because it could endanger American lives and American interests, Prime Minister Netanyahu would have backed down. But frankly, I don't even believe this version. I think, again, as you said, Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, and National Security Advisor said it one day, then the next day they walked it back. The president himself walked it back. I think the cacophony reflects the fact that ultimately, yes, this is a joint Israeli-US decision, but it's President Trump who believed that it's a marriage of what he saw as a historic opportunity and a man who is driven by hubris and self-aggrandizement, and who thought this is a chance that he had to finally do what he thought so many wanted to be done, which is to get rid of this regime. And I think he's finding out that it's far easier said than done.
Well, but this is also a man who is not a so-called neoconservative. He criticized vividly what the US did in Iraq and Afghanistan, to a certain extent in Libya. During the 2024 campaign, he is the one who said, I'm not going to start wars, I'm going to stop wars. So what changed suddenly? Was it the Venezuela episode? Or, I mean, how can you explain such a change? Because, as you said, this is a war against Iran, but it's also becoming a regional conflict.
It's a very good question. And had you asked me the day that President Trump was elected, would I have thought that this is the kind of war he would have waged? I would have said no, and I would have been wrong. I think what we thought we had learned from the president, not that he was an anti-war president so much as he was an anti-prolonged war. What he liked, I thought, was dramatic successes that he could achieve in a very short period of time. Sort of one and done. What he did by killing Qasem Soleimani in his first term, what he did by kidnapping President Maduro in his second term, what he did by bombing the nuclear facilities in Iran during the end of the last June 12-day war. Those were the kind of wars that I thought President Trump was enamored with, because it allowed him to expose himself, to show himself as a tough man who could make things happen, in his view, for the benefit of the United States. So not entangle the US in these prolonged wars, which he has qualified himself, as you just said, as stupid, reckless, and costly. This is a very different war. This is a war where whatever his initial thoughts were, by definition, was not going to be a quick fix, a quick success. It's going to last. It already has half a dozen American casualties. It's already having repercussions on international trade, on regional stability. What happened? Again, it's hard, as I like to say, this is not a matter of being somewhat knowledgeable about Iran or even somewhat knowledgeable about international affairs. This is a matter of being somewhat knowledgeable about President Trump's psychology, and I claim ignorance in that regard. But it would appear that he, as you say, he was emboldened by the success in his view of what he did in Venezuela and what he did by bombing Fordo. And appetite grows with each bite that he swallows. And he thought maybe he could be the man who will go down in history as one who will have changed the orientation, not just of one regime, Venezuela, from the anti-American to a American-friendly camp, now perhaps Iran, and tomorrow perhaps Cuba. And he seems to have been sort of enchanted with this vision for somebody who has that degree of narcissism and self-importance, and to whom his advisors are rarely going to say no. Maybe he just convinced himself he could achieve this at low cost and with great gain. Again, as I said earlier, I think he is likely to discover that that's not the case.
Right.
I suspect also that Prime Minister Netanyahu, I don't think this is Prime Minister Netanyahu pressing President Trump to go to war. President Trump had the ability to say no, but I think Prime Minister Netanyahu was very effective in dangling in front of President Trump the shiny object of doing away with this regime and going down in history as the man who achieved that.
Right. I mean, you negotiated a decade ago with the Iranians, the players. They were negotiations. It was already the case back in June, just as the war started, and just a few days before. And we even saw the Omani foreign minister go on a major U.S. News network to say a deal is within reach. The American negotiators then said, no, that was not the case. What is your assessment? Was the deal really within reach, or was this planned and, to make sure the diplomatic path doesn't succeed and that there'll be a war in the end anyway?
Historians will have to go through this in more detail, but I think the quick version of this is there were negotiations. How serious they were in hindsight is very questionable. You don't really negotiate an issue like this when the stakes are so high and the alternative is war by sending, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner every few weeks to have a few hours of talks with the Iranians, then to leave, then to come back with shifting objectives. Again, it was never clear, certainly to the outside world, but probably to the Iranians themselves, whether the goal was a nuclear deal, whether it also had to include ballistic missiles and Iran's support for its regional proxies, whether it had to include anything in terms of the repression of the massacre of the protesters that took place and any changes, commitments in that regard. So there was a cacophony coming out of Washington. My suspicion is that President Trump was of the view that if he could get a capitulation of the Iranian regime, and by the way, those are the words that his envoy Steve Witkoff used when he said that President Trump was frustrated that Iran was not capitulating, given that the alternative was war. So if he could have achieved that capitulation, which was never going to happen, he might have been happy to sign that deal. But alternatively, he was preparing for war. And I think it was evident now for the past few weeks that notwithstanding the negotiations that were taking place in Geneva, war was by far the more likely outcome and the preferred one in President Trump's mind.
Are you surprised by the Iranian response? Obviously, there have been strikes against Israel, but all across the region, even possibly as far as Turkey and now Azerbaijan.
So listen, at one level, people could say this is completely self-defeating because Iran is alienating countries with which it had normalized relations, or at least was improving relations over the past few years. But their calculus, I think, if you put yourself in their shoes, they feel at this point this is an existential war in which the only way it's going to stop with the regime still surviving is if they could externalize the cost. In other words, they can't be the only ones who are paying the price for this war, and it's harder to get American targets or even Israeli targets. The soft belly are the neighbors, are the GCC countries, and by striking them, I assume that the Iranian regime is hoping that they disrupt the economy, they disrupt international commerce, they sow instability and fear, and that will lead those leaders of the GCC and others to plead with Trump to end this war before it becomes overly perilous and overly costly. So to put it quite bluntly, if they think that the alternative, the option of that they face is existential and that the regime may collapse and die, then you have to weigh the notion of having a few more friends, and what good could they do if you're dead? They could just attend your funeral, or making a few more enemies, surviving, and then hoping that with time you could try to remake the friendships that you lost.
Last question. There is some talk that both the CIA, the Mossad, even President Trump himself are activating Kurdish Iranian groups based in Iraq to try maybe to cross the border and try to take control of a region to stabilize the regime? Do you believe this is a real option, and you believe it's a viable one?
I believe it's a real option. I think there's every indication that that is what the Israelis and possibly the Americans have in mind. I think it's a crazy option, a very dangerous one. If there's one thing that seems to be uniting Iranians, whether in the opposition or in the regime, it's the opposition to and the hostility to ethnic fragmentation of the country. So that's as I say, it's a self-defeating notion. But I think what it does is point to what the likely outcome of this war will be. In the best case scenario, best case from an American-Israeli perspective, it is chaos, it is fragmentation, it is a civil war. I mean, think, the comparisons with Iraq may be wrong in many respects, but in one respect, they are right that if this regime were to collapse, which I don't think is the most likely outcome, but if it were to collapse, you would have hundreds of thousands, if not more, people who will be at each other's throats. You'd have remnants of the regime that would continue to fight. You may well have the spread of terrorism and violence and chaos. And refugees, I don't see how that's in the interest of anyone, and certainly not in the interest of the regional actors or of Europe. That's the best case scenario from an Israeli-US perspective. It's a very dangerous one, and what we're seeing happening with the Kurds, if it is true, just confirms the fact that these are pyromaniacs who are working to set a fire to a region about which they understand very little.
Robert Malley, I want to thank you very much for being our guest today, and thank you all for watching this edition of Tête à Tête here on France 24.